was a kid, a group of us went camping. School or church group. Something like that, which I can't quite remember. Anyway, it involved woods and a river, and a whole lot of water activities like whitewater rafting. It was great fun, good times, apart from the last night. We'd been warned about the wildlife, and of course, there were plenty of adults there. The exact camping area we were in was pretty secure, but there was an occasional bear sighting here and there. Mainly if you left some food out, they might come nosing about. I had seen one particular bear a couple of times in the distance when we were doing some of the water activities, namely kayaking. What struck me about him was his coloring. I thought that bears were solely black, or at least a dark brown. This one was kind of a light gray. Very unusual. I never saw him close to the camp. He or she was always off in the distance. It was on the very last night that I got to see him up close. I must have had too much cocoa by the fire. I woke up sometime in the middle of the night, desperate to go to the bathroom. And I didn't want to have to go too far since it was so dark. I didn't have a flashlight or anything, so I just headed over to the trees, just behind the tents. I kept thinking of the girl's tent hearing me, so I ended up going a bit further. Just after I finished peeing, I heard this noise coming behind me. I crouched down, avoiding my own urine, even though I wasn't doing anything wrong. But it's embarrassing, and I still didn't want to get caught. That's when I could see the outline of a person, and it kind of looked like one of the park ranger guys who we'd seen wandering about sometimes, who'd also warned us about leaving food and trash outside. He looked like he was off somewhere in a rush, and then all of a sudden, he bent over, and that's when this began happening. His whole body seemed to shake, like he was having a seizure. That's when I was frozen on the spot. Suddenly, in this horrific moment, he just seemed to change. I don't know what I was looking at. It was also super dark, with just enough light from the sky. Then, once his body had started to slow down from shaking, I realized what I was seeing. I couldn't understand back then, and to be honest, I'm still not even 100% sure, even to this day. As the ranger had turned from a regular old dude with grayish hair to the bear that I kept seeing. Once he had fully transformed, he went off running further into the trees, and I went back to the tent, where I did not sleep for the rest of the night. Hi, my name is Larry, or for the sake of this story, I'll call myself Larry. I'm a 35-year-old accountant, based in London, England. I'm writing in, as I have recently been undergoing some mental health counseling, and I have an exercise in which I have to try and heal particularly traumatic incidents. When I was 17, I believe I encountered a skinwalker. I know it sounds insane, but please, bear with me. Listen to my story. I consider myself a kind and considerate person now, but when I was a teenager, I won't lie, I was kind of an a-hole. I bullied weaker kids with issues, kids from bad homes. Basically, anyone who I felt was below me, I made them feel even worse. I guess I just felt bad about myself and felt the need to embellish myself by putting others down. I feel bad about it now, and I've done a lot of work on healing the past. But one incident still haunts me to this day. So, in math class, the teacher had fallen asleep at his desk, and I decided to have some fun. I put on the teacher's glasses and began writing stuff on the blackboard. All the things I wrote were insults about the kids in the class. A few examples would be Larry Lisp Rafferty, or Michael No Mates because your mom's fat. It was pretty mean, but my friends in the class laughed and made me feel like I was a hero. The thing about it was, I never picked on anybody who I knew would stand up for themselves. I was always careful to target somebody who had low confidence and couldn't defend themselves. I guess anyone who reads this story won't have much sympathy for me, but all I can do is articulate that I am remorseful for how I treated people during my school years. Hurting people hurt people. And I guess I channeled my own self-hatred through my persecution of weaker individuals. On this occasion, in the same class, there was a class sitting at the back with long black hair. She was a pretty goth-looking girl, nose ring and all, dark eye makeup, and pale foundation to make her already look like ghostly white. She wore her hair down to her waist, and she had large glasses. She wore a dark blouse and deep purple jackets with black and purple striped stockings. She was actually quite pretty, but clearly wanted to hide her appearance away behind all the goth makeup. For the sake of the story, we'll call her Louise, but everybody called her Loser. There was a rumor going around the school that her father had been sent to prison for abusing her, and that's why she was so messed up. Her calmness and lack of interest in my bravado infuriated me. She was just sitting back there, looking out the window with her icy blue eyes. It sickened me. I wanted to make her recognize me and my power. So I shouted to her, "Why don't you come up and teach us math? You seem to teach your dad a few tricks." She continued staring out the window, and some of my friends laughed but looked pretty sheepish. I had clearly taken it too far. A single tear came down her cheek, and it was such a fragile event. I felt like someone had kicked me in the stomach. I went back to the front and picked on another kid. As I was walking home that evening, I wasn't too far from my house. I saw a dumpster in an alleyway, which was shaking. I wondered what the hell it was, but decided to just walk past it. A further bit along my path, I noticed a work van parked on the footpath. Its windows were all misty, and there was a screaming coming from within the van. It definitely wasn't lovemaking, but sounded like raccoons or some type of animal. At this point, I got a bit weirded out. For some reason, I had the urge to turn around, and when I did, I could see a figure about 10 feet behind me. It was Louise, but was not the Louise from class. This figure, this creature had the facial features of Louise, but was over 7 feet tall, with eyes which seemed to emanate red, and they were striking my heart through an intense stare. Although no pain, it was total fear that I felt. Her hands seemed to be covered in a matted black fur, and thighs that had expanded to look like thick tree trunks of hunk and muscle, like a damn dinosaur. The expression from this being was of an absolute fury, and I truly believed that I was going to die. I screamed at this thing to leave me alone. As I shouted, I fell to the ground and attempted to crawl backwards. This creature's arm extended out, and it raised its hands high up. At that moment, a large amount of static electricity and lightning began shocking through the sky. I began to cry and managed to get up and run back home. When I got home, I locked myself in my room and prayed for forgiveness. I knew I had somehow angered God or the universe by my humiliation. The next day, the person who was Louise, or whatever, was gone. Rumor had it that she had left school and moved back with her birth mother to Scotland. I didn't tell a soul about my experience. Years later and now, I wonder if Louise may have been a skinwalker, I guess you would call it. It would certainly make sense from my knowledge. If you can assist me in any way, that would be great. I know very little of skinwalkers. I know they're supposed to be of American native lore and legend, but I've also heard they are also shapeshifters, which, again, I don't know anything about. But anyway, this story is real, and I'm still dealing with the trauma of it. Please, help me.
At the time of these events, I was only about 14 years old. I had never been as far as a few miles away from my home, with the exception of staying at a friend's house. However, today I felt the need for adventure. It was around sunset when I ventured out into the flat marshlands of Alviso, my hometown. I was supposed to meet up with a few friends an hour earlier to gather a team to explore what some refer to as a ghost town. Keep in mind that up to that point in my life, I was never too superstitious and into paranormal things. They only seemed like things for TV screens. Anyway, my friends never showed up, so I was left to venture on by myself and my small dog Zero. I packed a backpack full of water, a sandwich, some dog treats, and of course a flashlight and pocket knife I had taken from my grandfather's garage. After walking about a mile from my house into the marina, Zero and I began on the trail that supposedly led to where the ghost town was supposed to be. In my head, I was a bit doubtful, wondering if this supposed ghost town was just a hoax or a local myth. Fast forward a few miles down the road, and I noticed that it's quiet. Dead quiet. There were no crickets or birds, just a small breeze brushing over the tall grass and water beside me. The trail was lit by moonlight and my flashlight. It was so dark. The trail was a levee, with water and marsh on the other side of me as far as the eye could see. I saw a broken bridge in the distance, and I began to get a little more hesitant. I started thinking, what if it breaks while I'm on it? What if the ghost town really was real? And what if I'm never seen again? I look down to see Zero wagging his tail at me, and this calms me a bit. We make our way to the bridge. We cross it safely and walk a few hundred more yards before my heart skips a beat. In the distance is the silhouette of a few small houses that looked demolished. In order to get to the houses, there is another newer bridge that is there only for the Caltrain to pass on. The bridge is pretty big, so I'd have to jog across to ensure that I don't get hit by the oncoming train. As I start walking, both me and Zero get a bit weirded out by the place, and I have a super strange feeling in my gut, telling me to get out of there. I ignore it and I push on. I finally reach the other side and the houses are in sight. All of them are in ruins, wrecked from the flood that overtook Alviso some time back. This was all that was left of what was once known as the town of Drawbridge. I make my way over to the houses, and though it sounds impossible, things got more silent than they were before. Whatever breeze there was now gone, and the crickets and birds were beyond absent. I could actually hear my heartbeat. I shine the flashlight in front of me and make my way into one of the houses. It's really creepy, with "Welcome to Drawbridge" graffiti on the wall. All is normal until I see frantically painted words on the wall that say, "Home of the Sheep Man." I get weirded out, and I'm about to leave when another bunch of words catches my attention. I shine the light on them and my heart drops. "Don't let Mr. Salim follow you home." And that was all I needed. I was ready to get out of there. Just then, Zero began to bark. Not just a regular I saw a squirrel kind of bark. I'm talking a defensive, ready-to-attack bark. I pull him back from whatever he's barking at, and I tell him to quiet down. Probably just a rabbit. He's pulling harder than I ever thought a small dog could. He's barking toward the back door, which has an open view of the marshland and tall grass behind the house. And that's when I see it. Standing no more than a few hundred feet away is a naked sheep. But it's large, far too big. I back up slowly and step on a broken piece of wood. The noise catches its attention, more than Zero's barking. As soon as it sees me, it stands on hind legs in a very humanoid way. I could make out from the distance that this thing was tall, taller than me. It's just standing there looking at me. Zero barks again with a bit of a whimper. This thing lets out the most bone-chilling screech you could ever imagine. You could compare it to the cross between a child and the tires of a car stopping abruptly. Its mouth opens slowly, and out comes my voice. My own freaking voice. But the tone of it just seems off, like it was being said through an old radio or something. It says, "Come here, Zero. Come play with me." Then it starts to walk toward us. Its stride is robotic, but at the same time it sways back and forth like a drunk man. It's getting closer to us at an alarming rate. I grab Zero and I bolted out of there. I don't look back, and I could swear I could feel something ice cold touch my neck. I started to smell rotting flesh, and I swear I was about to puke while running. My adrenaline is the only thing that kept me moving. I got to the broken bridge, and I tossed Zero to the other side. I jumped onto the bridge and it snapped underneath me. I could still walk on it though, so I hurried across. At this point, I realized that I had dropped my flashlight while running away. I look back. Big mistake. It's standing there on top of the house I was just in. Just standing. Even though it's crazy dark, I could feel its eyes looking back at me. I keep running with Zero all the way home. By the time I reach my house, it's already almost 3 in the morning. I told my mom that I was going to a friend's house, so she didn't bother knowing where I was. I got inside and put Zero back in the backyard where he stays. I crawl into bed and I leave the TV on that night. It takes a while to go to sleep, but I was finally able to, only to wake up to Zero growling again. But I'm too tired at this point to be alarmed. I wake up the next morning thinking it was a bad dream, until I see the scratches on the back of my neck. I told my friends the story, and we all agreed that if we ever go again, well, if they actually go with me next time, we must go during the day and we have to stay together. Ever since then, I always sleep with my windows closed and lights on, in fear that one day I'll see that thing again. I still check the backyard before I sleep. I don't know what this thing was. I don't know if this thing was Mr. Celine or the Sheep Man, or if they're one and the same. All I know is that I never want to see it again. Last year I was watching a few creepy videos about Native American horror stories when they described something that made me freeze. It was of a twisted creature capable of turning into animals that hunted us for fun. It described the creature I saw a few years back in perfect detail. I believe now that what I saw that night was some sort of skinwalker. I wish I was making this up. I just wanted to share my story so that people may think twice before going out there by themselves, especially at night.
Most of the time, stories involving the Lakusa are bizarre, sometimes accompanied by strange lights, missing time, and other anomalies. 2 men four-wheeling on a ranch near the Rio Grande Valley in New Mexico in the late 2000s had a front row seat to the Lakusa phenomenon and all of its weirdness. It was around midnight, and they had been drinking and zipping around on their ATVs. As they neared Black's Bridge, they observed yellow eyes about 100 yards in front of them. Just then, the ATV shut off, lights and everything. We had only drank a few beers, so we know we weren't drunk. The eyes started coming closer. We started to hear a baby crying, and soon after, a lady's voice calling the name Sophia right in front of us. Feeling spooked, the 2 men retrieved their guns, which they carried with them on their vehicles. Suddenly, a woman appeared out of the darkness. She was crying and asking for her baby. If that wasn't strange enough, from the left side of the riverbank, they began hearing what sounded like a baby crying. Assuming that a mother and her baby had run into trouble and had become separated, the 2 men proceeded towards the sound of the baby crying, looking to find it and get it back to its mother, and then get them to the hospital. As they moved down the riverbank, using the light of the moon, the crying got louder and louder. They soon began hearing what sounded like whistling coming first from above and then in front of them. They spun around and noticed that the lady was now gone. When they turned back towards the sound of the crying baby, they received the shock of their life. Standing in front of them, lit up by the light of the moon, was a huge, 5-foot-tall gray owl. The 2 men couldn't believe what they were seeing. They had both seen owls before, but never one this big. The sight of this human-sized owl frightened them, and they drew their weapons at the creature, which hissed at them and then flew off. The 2 men ran back to their ATVs. As they ran, they looked skywards and observed 3 of these human-sized owls flying around, making strange noises that, to them, mimicked the sound of a baby crying. The 2 men fired at them, but they continued to circle, eventually flying off after about 10 minutes. They spoke to a sheriff about their sighting when they got home, but they didn't think he believed them. If things couldn't get any stranger, the next day, the 2 men were eating breakfast at a diner in Old Mesilla, New Mexico, talking to themselves about what had happened the previous night, when a woman approached them. They described her as beautiful. She proceeded to tell them, "Don't be afraid of us. We are not after you. You cannot kill us with your guns," she told them, apparently revealing herself to be anything but human. She further insisted that they would almost certainly have been killed had they not intervened. With that, she smiled, turned around, and walked away. While it's possible that she had overheard them talking in the diner and decided to pull a prank, the man believes that, given the events of the night before, it is more likely that he and his friend may have encountered the Lakusa.
Okay, short encounter, but worth it. This was about 6-7 years ago, when I was driving back with my girlfriend from a concert late at night. We both swear by this. We saw a full-grown wolf turn in or shapeshift into a man in front of us. This thing leaps onto the road and then proceeds to look at our vehicle, stop in the middle of the road, and before our eyes, just like in the show Animorphs, if you've ever seen that, throwback to the late 90s, early 2000s, transform into a very weird shaped man, covered in animal skins, and then run off the side of the road. This considerably freaked my girlfriend and I out, and caused me to do a U-turn and drive a different way back home. I knew the history of my ancestors were cursed. Ever since I was a little boy, I had dreamed of being born at an earlier time, so I could get my own tribal name, and possibly bring our family's name more honor. Today, everyone just sees us as a permanent refugee or casino owner. My family's past is complicated and a difficult one. I always try and ask my grandmother or great-grandmother why that is. They would tell me tales that have been passed down from our ancestors since the late 1700s. My grandmother tells me not to bother my great-grandmother with such foolish questions from her childhood, simply because there's no way in her old age that she would ever remember them. Unfortunately, my great-grandmother has come down with dementia. She has her good days, and she has very terrible days. One day, I had come over to spend time with my family, and she began having one of her episodes. She walked around the house, speaking in the way of the old tongue, in which I had no idea how to speak. Our family got somewhat lazy in passing on the tradition of our language. I can make out a few words, but not many. However, one that I could pick up that she repeatedly kept saying was monster. My grandmother took her to her bed because she needed rest. I stayed the night at the house because I wanted to make sure she was all right. I checked in on her later and asked her if she was okay. She said that she was, and I asked her what monster it was that she was talking about. She said that she would tell me, as long as I promised not to tell grandmother that she told me. When she was a little girl, growing up with our ancestors and our tribe, she would occasionally get into trouble and sneak out of the village a lot to explore the woods and the wildlands around the area. She remembers that when she was younger, her mother would take her out back to forage for berries. She remembered that berry patch as having the sweetest berries around. Those were like candy for her. When she knew that she wouldn't be spotted by anybody, she would sneak out of the berry patch and eat some of the berries and play with her doll there. One day, when she was out there, she noticed a rather large fox skulking about. She gasped and ran, but the fox was more afraid of her than she was of it, and it too ran away. Thinking she was safe, she stayed there and continued playing with her doll and eating berries. A while later, one of the adults from the tribe found her there. He was a tall man that wore a fox pelt over his shoulders. He must have found the fox from earlier and skinned it. She snuck out again the next day, and for a while, that became her normal routine. She had told her mother and father that she was playing with some of the other younger children, and that she would sneak out to the berry patch. When she went out to the berry patch this time, all the berries were gone. She kept going through the patch until she found more, but she could not find any. She walked farther and farther away from the village, and before she came to a clearing, she saw that man again. The man that had killed the fox the other day. He still had the fox pelt on his shoulders, but what came next, she did not expect. Right before her very eyes, he transformed. This large man became this rather large fox, the same fox she saw the other day. His large forearms turned and formed into hind legs and paws. His legs shaped backward and became strong hind legs of the fox. He was now hunched over, and fur was growing all over his body. Large orange fur tufts came out of his body like weeds. She could only see him from his backside, and then he began looking around to see if he could spot anything. He was facing away from her until she caught a glimpse of his bright yellow eyes. They searched the tall grass for signs of watchers, turning ever so slowly towards her. She could see his entire body now, and this was no ordinary fox. This was probably 3 times bigger than a normal one. His paws were the size of large rocks, his white chest and underbelly still toned and cut from human form. She said his body looked so strong you could shoot an arrow at it and the arrow would break. His arms and legs were clearly defined and muscled from numerous previous hunts he has probably been on. She noticed his nose was moving oddly. His nose was twitching, trying to smell something. The more he turned her away and kept smiling, the more she realized he was smelling her. The creature started taking low, prowling steps towards her, and it spotted her. It was now hunting her. She knew if she didn't run, it would get her. She stood up and ran as fast as she could through the tall grass, and cried out for her mother and father, over and over, hoping that somebody would hear her. This beast, this monster began chasing her, but not quick enough to catch her, just quick enough to stay on her trail. Whether that was intentional or not is unknown. She ran past the empty berry patch and continued to cry out for her mother and father, screaming the word monster. She made it out of the berry patch, but by that point, it was too late. The beast had pounced on her. It ravaged her clothes, trying to bite into her, when a spear came over and struck the beast in the head. It cried out loud and took off into the tall grass. A hunter from the village had saved her. Her mother and father were mad that she took off, but were relieved that she was saved by that hunter. After that day, she never ventured out of the village again alone, in fear of seeing that terrible beast Shapeshifter. Obviously, shapeshifters are a huge part of my ancestry and legends, but sometimes what we think of as tall tales are more than just that. There is truth to them. Had that hunter not saved her that day, that man-beast would have taken her. Whether he practiced magic or not is unknown, but it's possible he could have been a skinwalker. With all the great things about my ancestors that I can really admire, there are very dark parts of our past, and that, the art of shapeshifting, is one of them. I grew up around many Navajo and Apache natives who have shared with me many ancient tales and warnings not to travel into certain blacklisted regions in the deserts for what evil lurks there. People who started villages and sects of life were destroyed by this evil. The same evil that is said to come from deep within the Sonoran Desert has made its way far north to where we thrive and inhabit. I myself am half native, and try and embrace my culture and belief system as much as I can. There is truth to the wisdom that is spoken to me through my people and friends. I have a deep love for this nation and do not wish to see it tarnished by the black magic of those evil doers that wish to wreak havoc upon it. The peace that is currently being upheld today is only because of certain protections and wards against those of the darkness, the Great Spirit. I know your channel is all about bringing alertness to these creatures that exist and practice evil out in the world, so that they can grow in their power and prey upon the weak. But I can share this information with you, in hopes that you can share it on your channel, and then maybe more people will become aware of what truly exists out there, and to stay away from. The more victims these creatures of evil claim, the more power they obtain, the more reign they have. You have spoken much about the shapeshifters of my land that practice magic and wear the skins of coyotes and other kills. But there is a far more powerful and smaller sect of shapeshifters that lie beneath the ground in caverns and underneath the deserts. The more power they obtain, the more their influence reigns in my region, the Navajo Nation, and even further north. These shapeshifters take the form of large desert reptilian serpents, serpent beings that devour dreary wanderers and tourists alive, or capture them to be taken back to have the life force sucked out of them. I've heard others call this same life force adrenochrome. I believe that's the scientific name for it, but that's what these shapeshifters feed on. They come out at once the sun is set in the sky, to wander the deserts at night, seeking those that they can prey upon easily. They are said to inhabit the bowels underneath the sands. There are many caverns underneath the deserts that should be closed up, and people should stay far away from. Several have already been turned into tourist attractions for those that enjoy underground caverns. This is very dangerous and potentially invoking the presence of these beings. I'm still not clear whether this sect of shapeshifters is even humans or something far more vile. Unlike the shapeshifters here, these entities possess far greater strength and can hide away much easier, revealing themselves only when they want to be revealed. They will even go as far as camouflaging themselves as a regular native, just to try and lure persons from nearby tribes away. I don't think it to be a coincidence that these shapeshifters are the only things to come out of the area of the desert. My people have talked about flying demons that also live beneath the desert sand. I personally believe these to be in alignment with these shapeshifters, or possibly even under their control to scout the area, looking for the next victim. I'm giving you this information because people who want to tour the area or just passing by need to be extremely aware and understand that driving through the area at night is incredibly dangerous. You need to be very careful, and you wouldn't believe me if I told you how many people go missing that are taken captive by these things, but are written off as lost to sex trafficking. It's horrendous. I'm just trying my best to keep my people safe by informing the uneducated. Please, it would mean the world to me if you could share this message. At least many who listen to it will take my warning and understand the true dangers that lie outside beneath the sands. My story takes place along the Bryce Canyon National Park in Utah. I encountered a handful of strange creatures, or what I would like to call desert witches that can shapeshift into reptilian beings. I would later find out from an experienced Navajo men and women that this was indeed true, and of course my friend. At the time, I was with my ex-wife, who during the time was my current wife. For the story, I will call her Jamie. I also feel the need to point out though that even the canyon isn't quite on Navajo reservation. It does border, and many of the Navajo have experienced wandering through the same canyon. Their experiences, from what I've learned, are very grim, to say the least, or so what I've heard. They claim this to be the territory of shape-shifting witches. Not the same thing as a skinwalker, I'm told. On this day, we were the only few people on the trail, and nobody else was really around. The isolation being bittersweet. Although I rather enjoy the privacy, it made the situation so much more heightened. On this day, we made our way about 1.5 miles down into the canyon before this strange lady was walking in our direction, muttering some strange things under her breath. We got a really weird feeling about her and kept away. She wore a strange veil over her face, and her clothes seemed out of place. I can't quite place the description that would accurately describe to you what she had, but it reminded me of Middle Eastern clothing. We soon forgot about her and continued walking past and continued on. Shortly after, we began to hear strange sounds behind us and around us. My wife Jamie at the time began to express to me that she felt uncomfortable, like she was being watched. I told her to look around, that there's nobody out here. I didn't hear the sounds, only she did. She still couldn't budge the feeling though, and we soon found an area to sit down at to take a break and have some water and collect ourselves. We were in conversation for only a couple of minutes before we began to hear, both of us, what I would describe as religious chanting. It seemed to be coming from all around us and nowhere at the same time. Behind us, around us, above us, and below us. I thought we were hallucinating, but it kept getting louder and louder. Jamie and I can both hear it, as we're both frantically looking around, trying to find the source of this noise, when this chanting starts to evolve into something much more disturbing. Growls and roars. The chanting grew and grew in volume, and then began to fade in sounds as the growls and roars took over. And then there was no more chanting, just roaring and growling. It sounded close by, but also far away. With the canyon structure and the rocks, I know the sounds can reverberate and play tricks on your ears, making you think there is something much closer than it actually is. Now, there was no more chanting, but it sounded like there were 20 lions trapped behind a rock or something, and it was seriously giving both of us the creeps. I didn't even have to motion to Jamie for us to get out of there before we ditched. Later on that day, after we had left, I told a close friend of mine what had happened, who happens to be full-blooded Navajo and knows the area around the reservation in the canyon and multiple other areas very well. He seemed scared when I told him what happened, and told me that I had apparently witnessed a shape-shifting ceremony, or at least heard it. This is what he described to me, that they were shape-shifting witches that go down into the canyon, and they usually sacrifice humans or animals and drink the blood and turn into these creatures. He did not exactly specify if there needed to be a sacrifice for them to shapeshift, but he did make it clear that they would get together and have some sort of ritual ceremony and turn into creatures. That would explain the loud roaring I heard and growls. It was terrifying. Even if his story that he told me did seem far-fetched, it matched up with everything we heard, which is terrifying. It would also explain the religious chanting that I heard. It very well reminded me of something you would hear out of the occult, or something along those lines in just another language.
So, lots of different activity there. And about a year after working their jobs, Joseph's wife started to get annoyed with a few of the locals and their typical coffee shop crap. Someone comes in, they buy a coffee, they stay the entire day trying to get free refills. Very annoying, right? And most of these folks, are kind-hearted. San Francisco hippies left over from the 1960s to 1970s. But, unfortunately, a few folks are dark or creepy. Like something about them just isn't right. One such person just happened to be this little tiny lady. He said that she couldn't be more than 4 feet tall, platinum hair mixed with gray highlights. She wore a blue woman's suit, the kind you'd see at a conservative church or something. She would come in every day around 8 a.m., ask for a glass of water, and sit in the same spot day after day. She would just mumble or chant. She would never touch the water she got, and she'd just set the water next to her at her table. And around 4 p.m. every day, she would get up, go outside, then proceed to accost the first person she saw for a ride to a random spot in town or out of town. She then would get rides to certain areas all around town till the evening, every day, and then disappear or go home. So now before, Joseph knew what she was, because obviously this is going to go somewhere, he was just one of the people who she had accosted for a ride a few times. She would tell him where she wanted to go, then, you take her out to the location, drop her off, and then she would ask you, ask to do meditation with you. She wouldn't get out of the car until you agreed to do this, which is it's a strange thing to ask a stranger. So, Joseph said he would play along, he'd, just to get her out of the car. And she would start the same way every time, hello, I am one of the teachers of wisdom through the mystery school of the 7 pillars of wisdom. Please close your eyes. Now imagine a ball of golden light floating above the top of your head. Now imagine that golden ball of light going down into your body and filling your whole being. Now take 3 deep breaths and exhale. Thank you. That is a quote. It's basically what she would do every time. And then, after this had happened, she would ask you if you had seen the golden ball. And of course, Joseph would say yes. or else the whole thing would happen. It would just repeat ad nauseum. It was a looping thing. He had to go through this process to get her out of his car. So once he did this, she'd get out, she would catch another ride from the first person she saw, and she'd do the same thing to them. And she would do this from 4 p.m. until she went home, or wherever it is that she would go. And it was as if it wasn't about getting to the destination. It was just about having as many people do her meditation with her as she could get. That's what he assumed she was really after. And he never saw her eat or drink, anything in the middle of the desert. She wasn't drinking at all. At least he never saw her do it, which, you'd expect that you would have to do in a hot desert. And after a while, she just started becoming a problem and was starting to scare people at the cafe. This lady would follow a customer into the washroom or into a corner, and she would just say, "Hello, my name is so-and-so, and I would like to show you something." And then whoever was, she was speaking to, usually a young man, would scream or yell, "What the fuck?" And they would run out of the cafe. So Joseph's wife had no idea what she was doing or what she had said at the time, but this had been going on for a couple of weeks at random, and his wife even had employees quit and say, and they would not say a word why, they just would abruptly quit. And Joseph's wife would ask her, this old lady, to leave, and the lady would just go back to her favorite chair and sit there with a shifty grin, mumbling till about 4 p.m. So Joseph's wife was really getting, she was really starting to get upset with this, and it was almost like it became a dark cloud that would fill the cafe every day. It was just this bad luck that seemed to plague the owners. Orders were being lost from suppliers, and her employees were getting deathly sick. Right? And that's harsh. Deathly sick. Something weird's going on here. And this caused Joseph's wife to have to work overtime, and she was just constantly stressed out. So eventually, she told Joseph all of the problems that she was having with this old lady, and she was just starting to get really upset. And Joseph told his wife that the next time she shows up, you tell her that she's not allowed in the cafe anymore, and if she refuses to leave, tell me, and I will leave my work. I will come to the cafe and physically remove her. So 8 a.m. the next day, Joseph gets the call from his wife. This lady's back. She refuses to leave. And Joseph's pissed. So he heads over, he goes to the cafe, and his wife and the employees start to tell him what's going on. And his wife asks the lady to leave, and the lady asked why. And the wife says, "You never buy anything, and we have had customers complain about you." So the lady says, "No one complains." And then my wife says, "Hey, you have to leave." And this is where it gets creepy. The lady looks directly at Joseph's wife. And as she does, her eyes shift. And she says, the wife told him that they shifted to cat eyes. The lady said in a nasty whisper, "I practice the dark arts, and I will kill you. Why do you think your employees keep getting sick?" And then her eyes shift back, and she politely smiles and goes and returns to her seat. So that is very creepy. Joseph grew up in a very religious family, but he left the church after, seeing the hypocrisy of the modern church. And, he went on to study paganism, magic, and other ancient religions. He also happens to speak an ancient type of Hebrew as well. But anyway, Joseph proceeded to walk up to her and ask her to come outside so he could speak to her. And she asks why. So Joseph raises his voice, "You need to get up and come outside now, or I will drag you out." Now, Joseph explains that as he's a decent sized guy, he works out, he's covered in tattoos, he has a goatee, he's bald, he's a mean looking guy, right? This old lady was unimpressed and started to pretend to be stupid. So he grabs her hand and walked her out. And when they got outside, she was asking what she did and what's going on. And he proceeded to tell her that the manager who asked her to leave was his wife, and suddenly her change, she changed, and she attempted to tell him who she was. And he cut her off and said, "I know who you are and what you are all about." And she says, "Oh, really?" And then she raises her hand. And Joseph assumed that, this was for some kind of spell or sign or something. She was pretty angry at this point, and so was Joseph. And, he started yelling at her in Hebrew, and then he started to pray in Hebrew. And that's when she started telling him not to do that to her. So, he got louder. She says, "Don't do that. Don't do that. Don't you do that to me." Over and over. "Don't do that to me. Don't do that to me." So Joseph got louder, and suddenly her face goes blank. He turns around, goes back inside. And by this time, the whole cafe and restaurant is watching this, this big tattooed guy yelling in an ancient tongue at this tiny white-haired elderly lady. And, he's trying to think about how crazy this must look to everybody. But then again, this is Sedona. And this is crazy is the norm here, right? So the old lady gets up, still saying, "Don't do that to me," and exits the building. They're outside, and he tells her she's never to come into the cafe or the restaurant again, and God help her if he sees her in town. She smiles, whatever, "Don't let me see you," right? She smiles at him, and she says, "God?" Like a question. And then she says, "Or what?" And suddenly, as if by download, Joseph remembers the black magic book he bought, some time ago, and he just read out, he had read this out of curiosity, and in the book, it talks about these wizard wars between Aleister Crowley and some other guy, and then it goes into the fact that if you can attain the true name of the witch or the wizard and say it, the said witch or wizard will die in 3 days. So this is this crazy thought he's having. So he tells her, "God has told me your real name, and I will speak it forth if I see you again." And she stops and looks at him, and she says in a weird voice, and she says, "Oh, really?" And he said, "Yes, really." And then she turns around and walks away. So this is when Joseph realizes that black witches are real, they're alive, they're all around the world, and they have real power. Or borrowed power, however you'd like to look at it. But before this event, Joseph has never really dealt with anything like this. And after this, it was like the spirit world opened up to him. And anyway, he goes back into the cafe. Everyone's staring at him, and he announces, to the cafe, that lady practices black magic. Don't give her a ride anymore, and please don't speak with her. Suffice to say, he got the weirdest looks that you can imagine. He sat at the bar. He told his wife, "If she comes back again, I will bury her in the desert." And he was really worked up. He was pretty mad about the whole thing. And then a couple of customers came up to him and proceeded to tell him about their experiences with this lady and what had happened when she followed them to the bathroom or the dark corner, or when they had given her a ride home, or if they had refused the meditation. And one man said, "I was in the bathroom, she came in right after me, and I said, and she said to him, 'I want to show you something.' Then her face would shift into a lizard face." And, Joseph got these similar stories from everybody that he spoke to there. Apparently, this old woman would shapeshift. And it doesn't end there. This is the beginning of the story from Joseph. So there's more to this. I'm going to try to get more from him, but essentially what it sounds like is not only is she into the black magic, but she's possibly reptilian, or it sounds like a shapeshifter.
I'm 18 years old, and my family and I had decided to go on a cruise the following week. But due to Hurricane Harvey, we weren't able to port back in Galveston, Texas, where we had parked our car. Rather, we were dropped off at the port of New Orleans, and my dad, annoyed at the entire situation, was forced to rent a car due to ours being stuck all the way in Galveston. From there, we were attempting to drive from New Orleans to Lubbock, Texas. We started early that day, due to it being a 15-hour drive. My younger brother, who was 12 at the time, was in the back seat listening to one of his favorite YouTube channels through his headphones, and my little sister at 9 years old was asleep. As time progressed, my dad got tired and asked me to drive while he slept. I didn't mind though. I was wide awake and honestly bored out of my mind. We pulled over on the side of the road at one point and we switched. I had a strange feeling, but I put it to me just being nervous. If I was about to drive, I was afraid I'd take a wrong road and get lost, and I didn't want to disappoint my family. I'm not good with directions either. Not to mention it had been raining really hard most of the drive here. I started back on the road, surrounded by swampy forests, and everything seemed fine. Soon my dad was snoring away in the passenger seat, and I decided to listen to some music to calm my nerves. As the rain began to pick back up, I had this feeling I could only describe as like a knowledge of something terrible about to happen. But I didn't know when or what it would be. I felt uneasy. I couldn't explain it. I tried to block it out of my head. It was dark, and I thought to myself I shouldn't focus on that kind of feeling. Maybe it'll just pass and everything will be okay. But then, I heard it. The sound that shattered my world. It was like a mixture of what sounded like a coyote and a small child screaming for their life. I had never been to Louisiana before, and I had no idea if they had coyotes out there or not. I grew up in a small town in Texas, and I've grown accustomed to that noise. I was startled, and I heard from behind me, "Lexi, did you hear that?" It was my brother, and he sounded more worried than I felt. I didn't want to alarm or wake up my sister or dad. I was actually kind of shocked that the scream itself didn't wake them. "Yeah, I did," I replied in a low voice. "Don't think about it. Just put back your headphones and try to relax." He nodded, then reclined back in his seat. I could tell he was scared, and he wasn't going to listen to my reassurance. But there was nothing else we could do. I kept my eyes on the road and kept driving. But only a few seconds later, I saw something coming up right in the middle of the road. At first, I thought it was a deer. I was worried. This wasn't our car to be screwing up, and I didn't want to hurt my family. Everyone was in this car, and we had to be careful. So I kept a close eye on the thing that was coming up, and as we got closer to it, I realized it wasn't a deer. Its limbs were distorted and changing and breaking in place, as if something inside of it was erupting outward. I started freaking out, realizing I had no idea what this thing could have been, and that maybe this was what made that scream. Its eyes glowed yellow, illuminated brightly by our headlights. Plans rushed in and out of my head of what I could do. I couldn't just stop, and I couldn't just turn around. I didn't know where I was or how to get home. I was relying on my GPS to show me the way, and quite frankly, I didn't want to do anything to make it follow us. I decided, as I was about 20 yards away, that I would go around it and pray to God that it wouldn't try anything crazy. I honked my horn at the thing, trying to see if it would startle it. It looked up at me. I could see its face clearly now. Its face was not entirely deer-like. It was almost human-like. I heard it mimic the noise of the car's horn back at me, and that dreadful, imperfect sound sent chills down my spine. I didn't realize I had been screaming until my dad woke up. "What in the world? What is that?" he asked me, and I could see the fear rise on his face as he looked outside the car and into the eyes of the deer thing. I turned quickly, towards the other side of the road, and I sped up. I knew if I didn't hurry and pass this thing, I could end up hitting another car. Then we'd all be screwed. As I passed it, the creature stood up on hind legs. It didn't even look physically possible to hold its weight up like that, but it did with ease. In fact, it looked ready to charge. But it didn't. Instead, it let out another cry, like the one before, then slowly walked back into the wooded mess next to it. Relieved that it was gone, but still scared out of my mind, I moved back to my side of the road, and I went twice the speed limit. I drove for what felt like hours, but was probably just 30 minutes. My brother and dad didn't say a word the entire time, and I didn't either. We just wanted to get home. After a while, I pulled over so that my dad and I could switch places again, and I was nearly too scared to take one step out of that vehicle. But once that part was over, I was just happy to almost be home. Even though New Orleans was beautiful and different than my small Texas town, I don't think I'll be going back anytime soon.
I live in southwest Washington State and had rented a vacation home in Lincoln City, Oregon to accommodate me and my sister's family, who was flying in from Hawaii for the Thanksgiving holiday. We had all arrived at the rental around 3 p.m. About 7:30 p.m., my son started yelling for me. He said my 1-year-old grandson had gotten into my case with my blood pressure meds, and sure enough, one of my pills was missing. We panicked and called Poison 911. They sent an ambulance and took my grandson to a small hospital in the area. The staff there did what they could, but told us they were not equipped for the situation, and my grandson needed to be transported to Randall's Children's Hospital in Portland, Oregon. So, on Thanksgiving Eve, a pediatric ambulance was sent from Randall's to Lincoln City, about 2.5 to 3 hour drive due to the holiday traffic. It arrived around midnight to pick up my grandson. My son's wife rode in the ambulance with my grandson back to Randall's. Me and my son went back to the beach house to get diapers and clothes and started the drive to Randall's at about 12:30 a.m. So here is where we encountered something that I and my son will never forget for as long as we live. We had been on the road for about an hour. The road has 2 lanes only, and it's a long, deserted road, especially at that hour of the night. As we were driving down this road, going about 55 miles per hour, in the distance, we both saw what at first we thought was a deer running in our lane of the road, coming straight at us. But within a couple of seconds, we realized it was not a deer, but a golden-colored horse. It must have been about 250 to 300 feet away at that point. It got closer fast. Like I said, we were traveling at about 55 miles per hour. As it got about 150 feet away, it leaped upwards and morphed instantly into a giant owl right before our eyes. The wingspan stretched past our lane in the road. Me and my son estimated it to be between 12 to 15 foot wingspan. This thing was enormous. My son swerved the car to the left to avoid it, and just as he did this, the owl immediately landed about 50 feet ahead of us to our right, in the little area outside the bike path. The owl kinda tucked its head and wings into its chest as if it were scared or trying to hide. As we drove past it, I got a good look at it out of my window, and with its head and wings tucked in, it still came up to about the bottom of the window of the Subaru. It seemed a little wider than the width of a beach ball, so about 3.5 feet tall and 20 to 24 inches all the way around the body. This thing was mind-blowingly big. As soon as this happened, it was almost as if a trance came over all of us. It affected both of us in the same ways. We both did not speak a word the entire rest of the drive, at all until we got to the hospital. The memory of the experience was crystal clear, but the curiosity and wonder did not hit us until driving back through the same area the next afternoon, after my grandson was discharged. We both agreed that this seemed to be some mythical creature or shapeshifter. I feel extremely lucky and blessed to have seen proof with my own eyes that animal spirits or shapeshifters or magical creatures do exist.
I've never been an experienced outdoors person, and I made the mistake one summer to go camping by myself when I encountered something I was not prepared for. I always knew I should have never gone camping alone, but I did it anyway, like I was trying to prove something. I made a major mistake, of course, being a rookie and being so nervous about it. I forgot one crucial thing: shelter. I packed my backpack with enough food and water, but I forgot my sleeping bag. I didn't want to turn around and call my friend, telling them I was too scared to camp. So I just decided I would just find some leaves and make a makeshift bed. I did have a small tent, so I guess I did have shelter after all, but I needed to do something. So, getting nervous and trying to calm myself down about what I was going to do in this strange predicament, I decided meditation would be my best takeaway. So, I found a nice spot and sat down for a while and tried meditating. I had come all this way and made all this time sacrificed. I was not going to give up now. This was a nice spot near a large lake. I had a beautiful view and a nice breeze. It was making things a little easier for me. I thought this would be the perfect place to meditate. I sat down, closed my eyes, and opened them, and started to meditate again. Just as I had my eyes closed, and I was really focusing in, a very loud crackling sound comes from the woods. This is where the story kind of changes. So I opened my eyes and looked around. I couldn't believe what I saw. Not even 30 feet away from me was this huge black bear. So I sat there frozen, tried to meditate again. I mean, I had no other option. I felt if, like, I were to get up and run away, this thing would have chased me and eaten me. I could feel my heart beating really fast. I thought if I just sat quietly, maybe it would go away. But I was wrong. The bear kept coming closer and closer, and it was making these strange noises, like huffing and groaning. I began to pray to God that it wouldn't come any closer, and I would be okay. I knew if the bear got closer, I would probably have to fight it off with my hands or something, which I knew was not a reality. This bear waltzes right up to me. It begins sniffing me, acting very strange. I stay as still as possible, not knowing exactly what to do. I'm sitting there, squeezing my eyes shut, not exactly sure what's going to happen next. And then, this bear just stops, stands up. I swear to you, this next part is real. I know it's common for bears to stand up on their hind legs, but this thing was standing different than a bear usually does. It was standing more like a man does, and even began chanting, as I recall. The bear began chanting, and I swear to you, I heard a voice say this aloud. It was almost telepathic, because the voice appeared in my head, not audibly. I heard the voice say this: "It's not what you think it is." I heard that loud and clear, and I opened my eyes again, and I saw this bear transform into a man, standing there almost like a statue. Now I'm terrified, and in front of me I'm seeing this person, what looks to be exactly like an old Native American man, covered in a large bear headdress with large animal skin draped over him, staring at me. This is all happening really, really fast, and I just don't know what to do. This person or thing just stands there, and I'm frozen in fear. not knowing what I should do. I don't know if it's a dream or what at this point, but I know I'm not dreaming. I know I'm awake. The next thing I know, this thing or person is chanting again, this time louder, and I swear, I hear the voice say again, "You have to go." And I had this vision of myself walking off into the woods, and suddenly I'm back in my tent. I don't know how I got there, but I'm actually in a sleeping bag this time, and I see a big sunbeam coming through the tent. I'm sitting up and it was morning time. Somehow, I don't know if I arrived in an alternate reality or what, because somehow I have a sleeping bag when I didn't bring one before. I was completely confused at how it was morning time, early morning, when I was meditating and around the mid to late evening. But all I knew was that I was alive. I didn't know what happened, but I knew I was very lucky. So, taking my chances, I packed up my tent and left. I can't even begin to describe to you just how freaky the entire thing was. I've never been one to hallucinate or just make up stories. Everything I'm telling you is true. I felt that I was very lucky to be alive. I don't know why I was spared. Maybe it was to tell this story. I don't know. I know that I will never go camping again by myself. I used to think it was just a coincidence, that I was attacked by a bear and that it was just some animal trying to protect its territory. Now, I believe that I was spared because it was maybe an omen. The Native Americans believed that there were these spirits that lived in the woods. They called them shapeshifters. I believe that that is what I encountered, and that it was some sort of shape-shifting spirit in the form of a physical, large black bear. Why it came up to me, though, and targeted me, I'll probably never know. When I was in college, I went camping out in the desert with a close buddy of mine who had horses. We fancied ourselves as some kind of cowboys of the old times. I was a city boy, so it was strange, exciting, and a wee bit scary, especially when he told me about coyotes, how they scream and howl, and can make terrible noises, but they shouldn't come too close to camp. Shouldn't being the word which made it scary. Since I never really stepped foot in the outdoors, I knew nothing. Very naive. I can distinctly remember lying there and hearing the noise. I was glad he had warned me about it, or I think I would have jumped on the horse and got out of there while I still could. It was disturbing and unsettling enough when I knew what the sounds were. Of course, he had promised me that they wouldn't come close, that we wouldn't hear the howling, snuffling, sniffing, and what sounded like one peeing on the side of the tent. Just stay still, he ordered, when I was literally shaking in fear. They're just being nosy, marking their territory. And I tried. Maybe it would have been okay, if it wasn't for the horses. They were tethered next to the tent, aside from a few disgruntled whinnies. They hadn't kicked up too much of a fuss, until now. Now, they started neighing and snorting, and we could hear them struggling and kicking as they were trying to break free. My buddy suddenly produced a gun that I had no idea he'd even brought, and a flashlight, although it was incredibly light out, considering we were miles from any kind of roads or houses. He said he just let off a warning shot to scare them. But first, he wanted me to go to the horses, as they would be spooked by the noise. Before this could happen, though, we saw the coyote. Now, as I've already told you, I'm a city boy through and through. The closest I'd come to any kind of wild animal was the zoo. I remember seeing a deer for the first time, and how amazing that was. I know, please, if you're a country person, try not to laugh. I was scared enough thinking this was a regular wild beast, with teeth and claws, and no sense of right and wrong. If it attacked us, it was bad. If it attacked the horses, it was equally bad, as we would have a hell of a trek back. But even me as an amateur in all things in nature knew what I was now seeing was in no way natural. The coyote, if you could call it that, to start with was huge. Giant. I'm talking supersized. When it saw us come out of the tent, it reared up on its hind legs, so it was like a coyote-type man standing there. My buddy, being a good old country boy, shot at it right away, spooking the horses. He pumped around 4 or 5 shots into that thing, and it just stood there, as if the bullets went straight through it, or it just wasn't being bothered. The horses were now going crazy. My buddy just stood there, looking shocked that this thing wasn't even being affected by the bullets. And then, it just gave an almighty howl, ran off on 2 legs, but quicker than I have ever seen any sort of man or creature move. After it was gone, we didn't say anything for quite some time. We were successful in calming the horses and going back to the tent. He stayed by the flap with it open, gun close in hand all night. As soon as it was light enough, we packed up, rode home. No questions asked. Once we were back and settled the horses, I asked him what that thing was. What had we seen last night? I had never seen him look so scared. Then, he proceeded to tell me about an old legend that he had heard since he was just a boy, but never believed it could be true. What he told me was something about a were-coyote. This was apparently a man who had made some sort of pact with black magic practicers who would grant him the power to shapeshift and change into an animal that he first killed and then wore the skin of. He didn't need the full moon, or for it to even be nighttime. As long as he wore the skin, he would turn. But as with all the powers over years, the man would become more beast than human, and would spend hours roaming the deserts, hunting, as an animal would, stuck in that constant half-life of part man, part beast. He was certain that that's what we had seen last night. I just don't know. It seems so unbelievable. And yet, I had seen that thing with my own 2 eyes, witnessed it being shot full of lead, and also, it racing away quicker than the speed of light. Something really terrifying. I would have to say that growing up in the age of strong men, beasts, and evil, it would be hard to scare somebody like me. As someone who fought in the Second Great War, I've seen and heard some very bad things that the world of men is capable of. Some of those things I have done myself, but never before had I seen something as twisted or demented as this up to my point in life. The year was 1942, and the Germans were holding an encampment of ours farther to the east, just south of the Belgian border. Our troops were deployed, and we were told to help push the Germans out of the occupied territory. Knowing what I did now, I probably would have never gone with the squad that day if I had a choice. Of course, I didn't, and of course, I had no idea what was to come out on the battlefield. Before the war, I was a high school history teacher, so I knew a lot about what happened in the First War. I knew a lot about what the Germans were capable of from the First War. Of course, we didn't know about them at all, and the experimentation they had done and continued to do during the Second War. But I knew enough that it could be more than helpful than just holding a gun. When the Germans began using gas to attack our soldiers, I was lucky enough to be at the front lines when they hit us with it. I managed to hold back some of our troops and saved a few lives from it. However, one of the Redskins assigned to our group got hit with it pretty bad. I don't particularly like their people, mainly because they hardly have ever bothered to learn American English. But after that day, he changed my mind about them. He began choking on the gas profusely, and all I could do was hunker down behind a building and wait for the gas to clear so we did not get shot down. The Germans were brutal, After they sent the gas in, they retreated, so those who got hit could suffer. Everyone but he died. He was choking on the gas, trying to breathe, when all of a sudden, he stopped. I sighed, feeling bad that another one of ours had died, and then I watched as he stood up from where he was, picked up his rifle, and charged at the enemy like nothing at all had happened. I'm not sure if anybody else saw what I saw, but I knew we couldn't go after him as the gas was still lingering. We were told to pull back for the night, and by the morning, we would pick it up again and try and take that part of the city back. When morning came, I packed up my gear, and 3 of us went to do a perimeter check to make sure it was safe to roll out. Only us and 2 other squads had made it. There were about 20 of us between the 3 squads left and 12 or so missing or MIA. We cleared the perimeter and were ordered to push on slowly while we waited for reinforcements from Belgium. What we saw, I don't think any of us could have believed. The Germans had made an encampment at the edge of town, waiting for us. It funneled into 2 large streets at the end, with 2 or 3 machine gun nests pointed at us. I thought we were goners, but what really stuck out was how much blood there was everywhere. Dead Germans laid everywhere, some over sandbag bunkers, some by the sides of the buildings, some in large piles that had been set on fire. It was giving off a slight red hue as the smoke trailed into the sky. I can remember it clearly. As we neared the machine gun nests, we found that all of the guns were broken and destroyed in some way. On further inspection of the dead German, it had looked as if their throats had been torn out or had been stabbed in the chest, but not with a blade. It looked as if these enemies were all attacked by a bunch of wild animals. There were at least 40 or 50 dead, a sizable force with a large amount of firepower. As we cleared the area to make sure all the Germans were dead, which they were, I came across one man who had been torn to shreds. Not by what looked like an animal attack, but by gunfire. It was the Redskin. He lay partially naked, with only his torn pants covering him, painted by his own blood, and what must have been the blood of others as well. I inspected him, and he was shot 3 times in the chest. That must have been what killed him. I thought the Germans must have taken him after he ran off, and he was killed by whatever else had killed the Germans. I started to pick him up so we can take him back to the sent home to his family. But when I did, his jaw fell open and somewhat large pieces of something fell out of his mouth. I picked it up, and it was covered in blood, and I began wiping it off. It didn't look like something that came from his body, because a piece of it shined. When I finally got done brushing it off, it appeared to be a piece of dog tag with German writing on it. It was him. He must have done all this. When I thought I was going crazy, I checked under his fingernails, and there were pieces of dried, bloody flesh underneath them. I freaked out. I dropped his body and began to turn away and run when my sergeant had stopped me. Panicked, I told him we had to warn command about the others in case of other Redskins were capable of doing the same thing. He told me that I wasn't to say a thing to anybody and reassured me that the Redskins, as I so called them, was a hero, that he put his life down and saved us by killing so many of the enemy. Knowing that command wouldn't believe a word of what happened there, he ordered us to burn all the bodies and told me to burn his especially, so nobody but he or I would know what happened that day. After we had finished that, he was to report it back to command as a friendly pilot, but had helped us out during the night and had hit all of their soldiers so we could press on. I didn't find out till much later in life, when the internet was made, that he was what they called a skinwalker. I had never been honored to know such a man in all my life. I knew him only a short while, but he was one of the bravest men I ever knew. I wouldn't learn this until much later, but back in that time, the military was deep into exploring capabilities with bioweaponry, bioexperimentation, and soldier enhancement. The small amount of natives that were enlisted or used against their will made for easy subjects to test out as super soldiers. In late April of 1937, a Ute Indian by the name of John Walker says that he encountered a night monster spider that spoke and warned against entropy while it wound its claws around him. According to the Sioux Nations, a skinwalker can act as a bear, a wolf, or a coyote, even a fleshwalker, or a moon-illuminated skinwalker, a subcult of skinwalkers. There have been reports of many moon natives. Commonly, the Sioux and the Ute refer to these humanoid spider-like beings with multiple arms and distorted faces with large fangs. While not necessarily resembling that of a spider, half man, half spider like you would think from the name, it's actually been called a night spider for many who have seen it. Many believe, like skinwalkers, that these are actually a derivative of skinwalkers or shapeshifters, originating of the practice of shapeshifting and dark magic. While rarely talked about, there are several reports of seeing these strange arachnid-like cryptids for years and years, often much more rare than people would like to talk about. These have been known to be spotted by a well-known explorer of cryptids, Richard Freeman, more often than not in obscure and deserted areas all throughout the country. Although it is doubtful they can be caught, as they quickly dart back into the night after fleeing from an encounter. I can't be certain as to what tribes and cultures of natives have their own experiences with these beings, like they do with Bigfoot and Dogmen. Again, I'll state that these beings are dangerous in their own right, but I believe they are a sect of skinwalkers that use their dark magic to contort their bodies to evil-looking things. During the days of the Blackfeet and Sioux Wars, a Sioux Indian by the name of Little Coyote claims he was sucked up into the sky by the spirit of a skinwalker. He claims he was sucked up into the sky and somehow ended up in a dark cavern, is how he described it. Surrounding him in the cavern were these night spider creatures, what he described as half man, half beast, with multiple arms, black hair, and huge fangs all over their face. Terrified, he managed to break free of the trap. The question remains is that he was sucked up into the sky, but yet somehow pulled underground. Is it possible that he was abducted and then, while unconscious, placed underground? We don't know. Although there have been sightings of cryptids, night spiders aren't talked about all that much. Not as much as you would think. This was years ago, and I'm still terrified by what I experienced this night. This was from another world, and I've heard of skinwalkers, and seen this coyote thing come onto our field multiple times, but never did I imagine I would encounter anything like what we saw, like what my brother-in-law would refer to as something called a night spider. Before I get more into that, there would be mornings where I would see this tall, upright walking coyote thing kind of just hanging around our field, like it was always waiting and watching for the next opportunity to do something. It was incredibly unnerving. It would always just be crouching down in the tall grass and watching. There had been a couple of times it tried to make moves on some of our small dogs and livestock, and it did. They'd go missing. Our entire chicken coop was taken, along with all the chickens in it. It was a small coop and not wired into the ground. Anyway, one morning, I look off to the left into the field. I don't see anything. I look to the right into the field, and I see this skinwalker creature that's staring back at me. Off in the distance, I see it almost every couple of mornings. It's out there and I want nothing to do with it. The same thing happens to my brother-in-law. He's very devout in the Navajo way, and he doesn't believe in what we call skinwalkers. It's like he's forced himself to confront this thing. One morning, he's out there in the field and this skinwalker, faceless, sneaks up from behind him, real close. How did it know my brother-in-law was Navajo? How does it know he's a spiritual man? It's like it puts thoughts in the mind, and does what it wants. He wasn't saying that, of course, but it's just a powerful energy. It was about as hideous as you can imagine it being. It grabs hold of my brother, and he's screaming prayers in Navajo, and this thing takes complete hold of him, dragging him back while subduing him. After it gets to about the edge of the field and lets go of him, it flees off, continuing to pray and shout. I'm not sure what my brother-in-law said, but it must have worked. The skinwalker had let go of him and fled off into the woods nearby. Right after he was freed, he's going crazy, telling me to never encounter it, never go looking for it. Although, I don't go looking for it, at least I do my best not to. I try and keep my distance from these things, if you understand. Being a traditional Navajo has a purpose, but a lot of Christian religions are more open. Part of me understands because it's validation for a lot of Navajo way practitioners to accept. That's there I mean. There would be a lot of people not believing without visual proof. You know what I mean? Like, when I first saw it in the morning, I would tell my father-in-law and my wife's father what I saw. They'd say that I saw it 2 days prior in the same spot. As it started getting closer, I'd tell a friend, and he'd say how he saw it 2 days again. Some people aren't really into that, or understanding the Navajo way. So, I respect that everybody has to make it their own mind. Now, the following couple of nights, this thing comes back, but it's much scarier than before. The first few times that we'd all seen it, it tried taking my brother-in-law, and it was in its coyote form. I say coyote form because that's the only way I can accurately depict what this thing looked like. When it came back the following night, or a few nights later, it looked something akin to that of a night spider. If you don't know, night spiders are a branch of shapeshifters under the skinwalker umbrella, and they specialize shapeshifting into these abominable beings. Instead of wearing animal skins like traditional skinwalkers, they use their dark magic to contort and turn into these hideous beings. They usually have multiple arms and large claws on each hand, deep sunken and black eyes, large black fangs protruding from their chest and mouth. They crawl more on their fours than they do walk around upright. I'm not sure if you've ever heard of these cryptids, but that's what I've heard them referred to as by many of the natives. I had no idea they were even a thing until I saw one with my own eyes the following night, as I'm about to discuss. So, I'm outside at night, pondering the day, having a small glass of whiskey that I just poured myself. I hadn't even taken into consideration that, well, I'd only had maybe 1 or 2 sips off the glass at the time, and I see this thing approaching from the field. The same spot where this creature disappeared the day before with my brother-in-law. I immediately knew it was this creature, but I did not recognize the form it was in. I just knew deep down it wasn't a good thing. As it came closer, even with how much light there was that night, I saw enough to horrify me. Immediately after its appearance, I went inside and woke up my wife. She had this big comforter over her, so I couldn't exactly see her face. I asked her about it first, and she's like, "No, there's nothing. You've just been drinking. It's the shadows." But I pushed that aside and wanted to make sure that she saw it too. I wanted assurance that I was not crazy, but she refused to budge, so I'm like, okay, screw it. And I go grab my 44 out of a closet, step back onto the porch, and in that moment, I nearly soiled my britches right there. 10 feet away from the porch, this thing is just standing there, like it was standing its ground on a contested territory. I got a good look at this thing. It looked like it came from the pits of hell itself. It was maybe slightly more taller than 6 feet, and it looked exactly like the night spider that I had mentioned. It was challenging me, and so I slowly pulled out my 44 and aimed it right at the center of this thing. I felt like I couldn't pull the trigger, like this thing was controlling my body. I felt myself tense up and had this paralysis coming over me, shooting through my body. This creature slowly smirks at me, I felt like I couldn't pull the trigger, like this thing was controlling my body. I felt myself tense up and had this paralysis feeling shooting all throughout my body. This creature smirks at me slowly, and I felt myself losing total control of my body. My hand, with the finger still on the trigger, starts to turn my 44 inwards towards my chest. I'm frozen and can't fight off what is going on with my body, as this thing is practically controlling my own muscles. Just as I am putting the 44 right against my own chest, against my will, the loudest gunshot I'd ever heard goes off, and this thing gets shot right in the chest from behind and lets out a horrible scream, like you wouldn't believe. Instantly, I feel my muscles relax and I drop my 44. This thing starts screaming radically and begins running off into the night as my brother-in-law came to me. He felt something was wrong and came just in the nick of time, like some sort of crazy sixth sense or something. He had shot this thing nearly point blank right in the back, comes rushing over to me to make sure I'm okay. Let me just say that as I'm recalling these events, I'm trying to do my best not to make it sound like some crazy fake story. I want to express it in a way that it's terrifying but also does the story justice. And this thing was somehow nearly getting me to kill myself via mind control or something. This is where my brother-in-law, who, by the way, like I stated, is full Navajo, and told me about night spiders, what they are and how they have this horrible ability to take possession of anybody they target, to make them do their evil bidding. He much refers to them as physical demons that have a form and shape. Anyway, there's not much else to add, but I wanted to say this before I had never ever really heard of a night spider before. Whether it's that of a skinwalker or whatever, they're extremely dangerous beings that should be kept at a distance at all times as best as you can. Feel free to email me if you have any questions. I'm sure I've missed some. My family are originally from Russia. My grandparents have some incredible stories about the old land, as they refer to it as. One of my favorites was about an elder who lived in one of the villages, who everybody was afraid of, as they believed he had the power to shapeshift and transform into animals. Wolves, bears, you name it. But he had a primary liking to shapeshifting into a bear, or what we call a werebear, as Western culture realizes this. Since this particular legend was meant to have happened centuries ago, it obviously wasn't any proof other than the word of mouth retelling this story over and over. But my grandpappy also believed that he had seen this famous werebear, because, just like their lichen counterparts, they are immortal unless they are killed in a very specific fashion. And this one was still around when my granddad was just a boy. Just like a vampire, I guess, the man would walk about in the daytime and appear like anybody else. I guess he must have moved around a lot, as to not cause suspicion, or maybe he was just awesome at disguises. Anyway, when Grandpappy knew him, he was still something of a loner, a village weirdo, a large lumbering man who was good at manual labor, but not much of a conversationalist, which seemed to suit him fine, as he was able to keep to himself without drawing too much attention. But of course, that kind of man does attract a certain attention, that of children who like to dare each other to do stupid stuff, like follow the funny man one evening and see where he goes, which was exactly how it came to be that my own grandpappy followed him into the woods one evening after having been dared by a group of older boys. Being nearly 100 years ago, there were no streetlights, not in a tiny rural village in Russia anyway. But thankfully, it was a full moon, so the light of the moon gave enough light. He said that he followed the guy right through the wilderness until he got to this sort of shack. My grandpappy was about to run back and tell the boys when the man ripped open the shack door and began screaming. Of course, the most sensible thing to do right then would have been to run far away. He just clung to the tree and prayed this giant of a man who was madly screaming and howling was maybe just having a mental break and needed to go out there and let off some steam. All of a sudden, he heard this terrible cracking sound. Cracking and screaming. He just stood there, terrified and mesmerized, as this huge hulk of a man changed from a man to a bear. A huge, hairy, massive, powerful man-bear with ginormous paws and claws. It began howling and stumbled off, smashing through brush. Once this thing had run off, my grandfather raced home, flooding with tears. He said he never told the other boys or anybody what he'd seen. He was simply too afraid, as if somehow retelling the story would make it all too real. But he made sure to never go anywhere near that man again. And that's my grandfather's story. He's always been pretty upfront with me about how real it was, and has never lied about it. Now, could that have any correlation to modern-day werewolves or werebears? I don't know. I like to think of it that he was cursed.
What up, YouTube? This is Fleur Broom coming to you again. I know I'm coming to you kind of last minute. I just want to make a video based on some of the, I guess they would be considered ETs or our ancestors. I'm not quite sure what they may be, but I wanted to come to you, family, based on some information that has come about. Now, some of this is coming from some documents I'm seeing, some of the old pictures. Do you remember when you saw like the hieroglyphics, and you always see like you know, the Egyptian monarch, you know, the pharaohs and the queens dressed in what it looks like animal gear? Well, what I've noted, family, is I found out that some of the ETs, and I don't know that they're ETs, they're ancestors, but they come, you know how we talked about cloaking and shape-shifting? Well, it's not only the reptilians who do that. That some of the ancients did that as well, obviously, and some of our ancestors did that. What they did is they shape-shifted, and I have some video, I'm going to add it to the bottom, of some really weird kind of video about a woman who was a bird, black bird, who shapeshifted. She hit a gate in Nigeria, I think it was in some part of Africa, and when she hit the bird hit the gate, it fell down and it started to transform into this melanated black African woman. And there were spectators around taking tons of pictures. You don't really see her shifting into that, but you see them taking pictures of this woman who's sitting on the ground, and she's like, her skin looks odd. And in the video it states that she shifted. They watched her transform. I mean, it's like tons of people surrounding her taking pictures. They saw her transform from what looked like to be a beautiful black bird hitting the ground to a melanated woman. And it makes me think of the times. Do you remember when all those kills, remember when, okay, I know you remember, my conscious family remembers this. Remember when there was like a mass amount of deaths of black birds in Arkansas? Like, there was the first time, I think it was 2010 or 2011, January 1st, they denoted that these birds may have died due to shock from fireworks and so on. But we know later on that was the beginning of all these massive deaths of birds, you know, dolphins later, all kinds of fish kill, you know, animals just dropping dead out of the blue. But in particular, I remember that we had a massive deaths of black birds, and that was the first that we heard of all these odd deaths in these birds. Like, they would just drop out of the sky. They were hitting cars, they were dying on the road, they were falling out of the sky, and they were blackbirds. And it makes me think, apparently there is some correlation between blackbirds and perhaps shape-shifting melanated females that turned from birds to humans. What I found out is that there is a correlation between those black birds and some melanated female beings that are shapeshifting. Sorry, it's one of those days. Shapeshifting into humanoid beings. And this has happened in Africa. I've heard this before, but it's weird. Like now you're starting to see this come out, and I'm starting to believe, because with my contactee experience, remember that conscious one I talked about being lifted up, something grabbed me from behind, and I never saw the face of whatever was bringing me up. And usually when some contactees talk about when they're brought up to the crafts, they usually denote that when they're brought up to the crafts, sometimes they're beamed up, like they're particleized, departicleized, and then or they're beamed up and they're like they're paralyzed, and then they're brought up by a beam of light, and then they're right onto the ship. I didn't have that experience. I had an experience of something taking me by my waist, and it's not the first time. I've had like not conscious experiences like the last one, but semi-conscious experiences where I remember something bringing me up, like I was always flying up with something. And I'm just saying, I'm putting pieces of the puzzle together. What if those ancestors were actually birds? They were shape-shifting from black birds, huge black birds, and they, sometimes they take us, because we know if you have melanation, you can fly. Melanin allows you to do a lot of things. That's why they cover all these crafts and even rockets with like a type of melanin on top, so it can beam out of the atmosphere, because without melanin you cannot travel to you cannot leave this planet, you cannot leave this atmosphere, you cannot travel into the cosmos without melanation. And they cover those rocket ships with melanin to be able to leave the atmosphere. So wouldn't it make sense that we knew that there were ancestors that flew, not only with crafts, but the light beings, the etheric beings, are able to fly? I wouldn't put it past the fact that if we have shapeshifters, that it would be our melanated ancestors too, not just the reptilians. There's other entities living here inside and outside the earth, on the surface of the earth. We have the inner earth, and we have those living out in the cosmos, our cosmic family. But I want you guys to start looking into the black birds and this correlation with the birds, the feathers, the wings, and our ancestors, which is all over the hieroglyphics. With you always see Isis has wings sometimes, right? I think Nefertiti in a couple of the pictures has wings. Maybe it's not so far-fetched that they actually had wings and they're able to shapeshift and fly off. I mean, I know it sounds crazy, but you do know we're living in a mad world where everything that seems sane is actually insane, and everything that is insane is actually rational and sane. We noted that black birds were the birds that were dying, and maybe it was purposefully done to kill off these black birds, because maybe along those flying, the family of flying birds, there were some of our ancestors that were part of that flying flock, and the others.
I went through a real rough patch nearly 10 years ago now. It caused me to be homeless for a very short time. Being homeless in the city means plenty of shop fronts to sleep under, cardboard boxes in alleyways, and even communities of other people without a roof over their head. Being homeless in the country means finding a big enough tree in the woods to give you some shelter, and fighting animals for food so you can actually eat something. It also means that sometimes you witness crazy stuff, all whilst hiding behind the trees. I've seen a couple go deep into the woods for a special meeting several times, whilst I know both of their actual partners are at home. I've seen a guy talking to his dog like he's some kind of therapist, letting it all out to this canine doctor. And man, did he have some weird stuff to confess. Kids drinking, people smoking weed. Scandalous, but everyday people drama. However, one day, I saw something that was about as least as an everyday routine as you can possibly get. It was around early November time, and it was right when the evenings and nights were starting to take their toll. At the time, I'd managed to make myself a sort of den that I'd crawl into, having found various blankets and other stuff that I regularly raided. But it was still pretty freezing out, and I was beginning to worry about how I was going to last all throughout the winter, much less survive with little food. And there was also less food to gather now, too. Several of my buddies seemed to be starting to hibernate, so at least I felt like I had competition for what food was left. I had a little fire going, having just enjoyed some rabbit that I caught, when I heard the sound of something moving really fast through the tree line. I usually tried to put the fire out, or at least cover it, so I didn't draw any attention to myself. But there was no way. Whatever was trampling through was a person. It sounded big, and animals usually don't come near me if they see fire. There aren't many predators out there, but I wanted to be prepared. The crashing and banging of this whirlwind was coming closer and closer when it came to an abrupt stop, not too far away from where I was, settled in for the night in my little den. I could see just by the light of my fire a huge figure of some sort of creature. It appeared to be standing up on two legs, but also appeared as if it was in great pain, and it was flipping its great mass all over the place. I heard it howl and growl, and for a second in the light, I could just make out what it was. It appeared to be a bear. Now I was worried, as this beast was clearly rabid or diseased from the way it was acting. I just stayed very still, glad I was still partially hidden by my den and the trees I was around. I considered extinguishing the fire again, but decided not to draw any attention. And then, in the dull light of the flame, something even scarier had happened. I watched open-mouthed and trying my best not to scream or throw up, as the bear seemed to shed its skin. The low light only allowed me to see so much, and I was grateful, as the whole process appeared barbaric. Bones breaking and shattering, skin tearing, the bear screaming simultaneously. Thank God it only lasted for a few moments. And there stood exactly where the bear had been, not even moments before, was a man, naked, dropped to his knees, and panting. He was back up, and never made a sound. He eventually got his breath, jumped up, and ran off. I didn't recognize him, but then I only saw him from the back, and in such faint lighting from the fire. Plus, I was in shock from what I had just witnessed. I'm not sure I would be able to process this if I knew him or not. I've heard about werewolves, seen plenty of movies, and those movies also showed the whole man to wolf transformation. What I think I saw that day was reverse. It appeared that I saw a werebear turn back into a man, and it was every bit as horrific. I understand this sounds absolutely crazy, and probably fictional, and I never in my wildest dreams would have imagined this being remotely true, but I can't deny the truth of what I saw. My guess is that there was some serious black magic or curse involved. It's the only way to explain such a bizarre, supernatural phenomena. I know what I saw, and it was not normal. All a silhouette. It was very, very strange. The Navajo Reservation is the largest res in the U.S. It goes into New Mexico, Utah, Colorado, and Arizona. This story takes place in the northeastern region of Arizona, near Indian Wells. This was told by people from around that area. If you are heading west on State Highway 15, out towards Dilkin, you come to a stretch of road that goes onto a small valley. I remember going down this road in my youth. If you looked at the horizon, it would seem as if the road kept going, and then suddenly, Your car would be pulled down by gravity as you followed the road. It would always give me butterflies when we would go down the slope. When I heard the story about this road, it made my stomach feel different. A man was driving home one night, and it was very late. It was a drive that he had done before, so he wasn't too bothered by it. When you are driving on the res, sometimes there isn't any way to keep cattle from getting on the road. No fences means that you need to be extra aware. I was always told to look for the black horse. If you see a black horse, then you'll be able to see anything else that may wander into the path of your vehicle. So, this man is driving home, not paying too much attention. He drives down the slope, but when he gets to the bottom of the valley, he sees it, but doesn't have enough time to react. Suddenly, a horse comes out of the darkness. He slams on his brakes, but he is unable to stop and hits this horse with his truck. The impact was not enough to deploy the airbags, but the man was tossed around quite a bit by the incident. He turns on his emergency lights, gets out of the car to assess damage. The front of the car was crumpled, and one of the headlights clearly destroyed. He cursed out loud. This was the worst place to have an accident, and he did not have signal to phone for help. He then remembered the horse. The man went into the cab of his truck, got a small keychain flashlight. He then started shunning around, looking for the wounded animal. He heard noises, but they did not sound like a horse. He was positive that he did hit a horse. As he approached the sounds, he could see the animal's fur moving from its ragged breathing. As he got closer, he began to realize what it was. There was a naked elderly woman, wrapped in a large pelt. She was moaning from pain. The man stopped dead in his tracks and got weak from fear. He stumbled back to his truck, and although it did suffer plenty of damage, he was able to get it started and drove off. Once he was able to get signal, he properly called the authorities. An ambulance drove out there and recovered the woman. She was driven to a local health care facility, and due to the fact that many of the healthcare staff were Navajo, nobody wanted to even touch the woman. The woman was apparently known in the community. She was thought to be bedridden. This was shocking because she was so far from home, and the state she was in was immensely off-putting. She still had on her attire when she arrived at the hospital. The nurses called for her family to come. When her family got there, they removed her pelt and her jewelry. The staff were very frightened, but there were some non-Navajo staff that still provided her with care. The elderly woman had only bumps and scrapes. Other than that, she seemed just fine. She was able to get up and walk around the same evening. She went home with her family that same night, but after a couple of days, she passed away. In Navajo culture, if you find out who a skinwalker is, you have the power to destroy them. After the community around Indian Wells found out